And to start off the proposition, we now welcome Caspar Cubitt, a third-year theology student at the University of Edinburgh. Caspar, the floor is yours.
Right, magic. I'm a theology student, so I'm really used to being in this hall. Mostly, I am here. I spent countless hours sitting around talking absolute nonsense to whoever will make eye contact with me. So I'm amazed they allowed me back, so thank you. And this time they give me a microphone, which is even better. So tonight I'm hoping to break the trend of a lifetime and maybe say something a little bit more coherent than usual. There are no guarantees, however, so bear with me. What I'd really like to do this evening as first speaker is set up this debate very carefully. The motion is quite broad, and so I'd like to specify exactly what we're going to argue as the proposition, as there is a little bit of a danger that both sides will end up talking past each other, and hopefully you as an audience can judge a little bit more effectively whether we have done our job convincingly, so no pressure whatsoever. Before anything, the most important bit is to define what we mean by traditional masculinity. We need a solid definition, otherwise the whole debate collapses. I would like to make it very, very clear that we are not going to argue, or at least I'm not going to argue, against masculinity inherently. Masculine traits like confidence, protectiveness, assertiveness, independence, and physical strength, for example, can be valuable. Again, these are things that are sometimes be seen as masculine, but they are not mutually exclusive. These can come from biology or culture or a mix of both, and they are not harmful in and of themselves. Traditional masculinity, however, so the wording in the motion is key, is something very different. It is not simply masculine traits, it is a social script, a set of rules which tell men how they must behave and what they must avoid. We draw our definition from the sociologist Raymond Connell, whose theory of hegemonic masculinity is, what we would like to think, is the leading academic framework in this field. And she argues that traditional masculinity is not some kind of personality type or innate essence. It is a cultural idea, almost a performance that societies have historically rewarded. This is a script that includes traits such as emotional stoicism. It defines worth through dominance. It sometimes presumes heterosexuality, discourages vulnerability, rewards risk-taking and self-reliance, and punishing anything coded as feminine. And this is the definition that we would like to argue by. Most men don't fully embody this by any means, but all men are measured against it in this framework. So this is the traditional masculinity we are debating is harmful. So our claim is simple. This script harms men, harms others, and harms society. And harms a society that keeps on performing it. We're not saying that no good ever comes from it. These virtues can appear attractive, but they do not require the traditional script. And we'd like to say that the harms produced by that social script vastly outweigh any possible benefits that are brought to the table. I won't endeavour to go too much detail when it comes to these harms necessarily, and my colleagues will do a very, very good job of doing that. They'll be pinpointing exactly the sources of traditional masculinity. They'll give systematic reasons why these qualities aren't good, and as well as showing that how this form of masculinity, so traditional masculinity, is dominantly white and has perpetuated racism and other structural hierarchies. However, I'm going to do something different and lay the groundwork for them so they can elaborate further. So I'm going to discuss the two harms that will be relevant, which is harms to men and harms to others. To be blunt, traditional masculinity teaches men to fear vulnerability, because vulnerability in that framework is treated as feminine. And we don't need to guess where this begins. We do see it in early childhood. I'm going to sound very, very monotone as I refer to some studies, but it is important because it does show the evidence is overwhelming in favour of this. There are researchers in the University of Yale and School of Medicine that show that when young children cry, adults who are confronted by it, they tend to comfort girls, tell boys to be brave or stop crying. By age 4 or 5, they estimate that boys are already suppressing sadness. Or there's more recent work that shows that children that don't receive emotional validation grow up far less willing to talk about their feelings. So boys really receive less validation, they learn silence early, and then they carry into adulthood, as you can imagine. And the clinical evidence in adulthood does confirm this evidence. Study after study on mental health finds this pattern. The more strongly a man feels he must live up to a traditional script, to be tough, to be self-reliant, to never show weakness, the less likely he is to seek help even when he is struggling. So there's research from King's College London that shows that men who identify with traditional masculine norms are significantly less likely to speak to a therapist or a GP. Or there are interviews with men who are experiencing depression, and they reveal the most common barrier to seeking help is fear of looking unmanly. And when you ask men why they don't speak to a doctor or a therapist or even a friend, the most common answer is quite simple, and it is, I did not want to seem weak. That is that social script that we are referring to at work. And so when that sadness becomes shameful, it doesn't disappear. It becomes anger, it becomes withdrawal and self-destruction. And so the consequences are visible in the national data. I don't need to remind everyone that men make up about 75% of all suicides in the UK. And that's not necessarily because men are more naturally inclined to being suicidal, but it's because this script that is set up traditionally forbids them from expressing pain, from seeking help, or admitting some kind of vulnerability. And I think this is incredibly harmful going forward, and I don't believe we should be continuing this whatsoever, or even sort of endorsing it as positive. And secondly, we've got to address the harms to others. Because that is also an incredibly important thing, because it's not just men, it is everybody else, it is women, it is members of the LGBTQ, it is so many other people, it's society as a whole, it is hierarchies that are being built on this. And so this isn't sort of speculation that it harms these like everybody else. There's research from the University of Michigan, as well as University of Toronto, that men feel more pressured, men feel more pressured to live up to the dominant, this dominant masculine ideal, the more likely they are to express misogynistic attitudes or endorse violence as a way to resolve conflict. Again, it's not because men are sort of inherently violent, because the social script does reward this dominance and punishes any kind of backing down. To be clear, this reward I'm referring to is sort of status, respect, attention, and/or power. And so I'm sort of referring to sort of patriarchal issues. The American Psychological Association's Task Force on Boys and Men, that isn't a mouthful, identifies traditional masculinity norms as one of the strongest predictors of homophobic attitudes, because anything coded as feminine is treated with contempt. And the LGBTQ identities get sort of placed on the receiving end of that contempt, sadly. And I think probably one of the most important bits to go to is gender-based violence, because that is the crux of this one when it comes to talking about other people who are most affected, and that is women, and it is how the consequences manifest themselves most of the time. There's strong evidence everywhere from the World Health Organization that shows that endorsement of these traditionally masculine norms that we refer to, especially dominance and control, is a major factor in the perpetration of violence against women. And again, I will reiterate that these behaviours aren't biological, they aren't scripted, they are scripted, they are learned and they are socially rewarded. This traditional masculinity doesn't just shape individuals, it shapes the institutions that we live in. So when boys learn that leadership requires toughness, we build workplaces that reward aggression over empathy. When asking for help is weakness, we create political cultures that value certainty over reflection. And so obviously we're going to get objections that say that this isn't real masculinity, that these aren't real men, that this is not true tradition. But I'd like to think that this is a bit of a no true Scotsman fallacy, that you're sort of shifting the definition every time evidence appears against the definition you are working by. So every time we point to harm, someone insists that real men won't behave that way. But that's not offence. We feel that's a bit of a dodge. So if the only way to defend masculinity is to keep trimming away the bits that cause harm, then what's left isn't traditional, it's something new, it's something better, open, more human. And that's exactly the kind of masculinity that we will be arguing for, and that my colleagues will continue to argue for.